Cessnick plans to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have Q&A for the rest of the hour. If you do have a question, if you'll fill it in chat, which you can find on a lot of systems at the bottom of your screen, hit chat and you can ask a question. If you get frustrated with that at the end of the time, we'll also try to look at people raising their hands as well. So we'll try to get questions in. Jen, what else would you like to tell us on the tech side?
Not much. We should just be able to relax and enjoy this lecture. If I see most people are muted, which is awesome. If I do see anybody who gets unmuted and I hear background noise, if it's interrupting, I'm gonna probably mute anybody. And then after the main part of the lecture, when it's question time, if you're able to get to the chat, that'd be great. But if not, you can you can unmute yourself and ask the question. So I think it should be pretty straightforward. It's a lot less complicated than some of our other meetings. So hopefully we've all done it once or twice by now.
Yeah, everyone here is getting to be professionals at Zoom, I'm sure. So
definitely.
Well, thank you. But first, it's great to see so many of you First Presbyterian folks out there, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Jean-Francois Cessnick. Many of you know him from our lectures in the past. Let's see if we can highlight him on the Jen. Well, I'll wait till I finish introduction. Dr. Cessnick is a political scientist specializing in business and finance in the Middle East. He is currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and scholar at the Middle East Institute. He has taught for 35 years at Columbia, Georgetown, and Johns Hopkins universities, and he is managing director for the Lafayette Group. Dr. Cessnick has 25 years experience in international banking and finance, of which 10 years were spent in the Middle East. He has written and lectured extensively on the industrialization and politics of the Arab-Persian Gulf. So it really is our pleasure to have you speak to us today. So welcome, Dr. Cessnick, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. It's really always a pleasure to speak at the church, of which I'm a proud member. And so, of course, we want to talk about the Middle East. I understand that one of the favorite expressions of COVID-19, which came out of this year, is something called rabbit holes, and where we go into something and we never know how we get out of it. The Middle East is nothing but a big series of rabbit holes, and I did not know which rabbit hole to decide on. So I finally decided that perhaps I should try to go down the rabbit hole called Saudi Arabia and Iran and the United States, the relationship with the United States. What I thought I could do perhaps is first talk a little bit about the Saudi point of view, because a lot of things have changed with the new administration. There's a lot of talk on whether we should rejoin the nuclear accord, the JCPOA, and whether we should change our policies with Iran and also with Saudi Arabia, because we've had a lot of problems with Saudi Arabia, and especially in terms of how they work along with our values. So perhaps I will start with a little bit the Saudi point of view, and maybe Jen could put up the green map I have I had prepared for us, and we'll see how that can go. But the main point there is that from the Saudi standpoint, Saudi Arabia feels, as you can see, Saudi Arabia is very much in the middle here, and feels very much surrounded by Iran and the friends of Iran. So let me go through that a little bit. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, there is Yemen, and we've had a lot of problems. The United States has criticized Saudi Arabia, and the Congress in particular has criticized Saudi Arabia a great deal about how it has handled Yemen. Now, as you can see, Yemen controls all the southern side of the Arabian Peninsula and has about 25 million people there. Many of them, many Yemenis actually live in Saudi Arabia, especially near the border area and all along the Red Sea coast. So today, Yemen, of course, is mostly controlled by what's called the Houthis, who are themselves pretty much controlled by the Iranians, and especially by one of the Iranians group, Iranian-backed group, Hezbollah, who is really arming the Houthis, and which has managed to send a lot of rockets and drones over to Saudi Arabia, and that scares the Saudis enormously. To the north of this, of course, you have Iraq. Iraq is also very much under the control of the Iranians today, in spite of all our years over there. The military structure of Iraq never really got rebuilt after we destroyed it. And most of the military alliances in Iraq, or the military groups in Iraq, are really controlled by Iran through a bunch of militias. So just like Yemen has an is enormously influenced, and the Houthis are enormously influenced by Hezbollah, the Iraqi are very much influenced by many different militias, which are under the full control of Iran. Then you have Syria, and Syria, as we know, has been a major problem for everybody. Today, the main government of Syria is still pretty much in charge of Syria, but there are whole areas which are still controlled by the more extremist Al-Qaeda types, and in the north, mostly by the Kurds. Now, the Syrian military is very strongly influenced also by Hezbollah. And one of the events that takes place regularly in Syria is the Israelis go in and bomb some sites, especially around Damascus, which are basically controlled by Hezbollah. So Hezbollah, of course, is a Shia militia, and which is in this case financed and very much controlled by Iran. The Lebanon to the east of Syria, of course, today is in complete shambles, as we have all seen and read. And the Hezbollah, again, is very much in control of Lebanon today. Even though Lebanon is supposed to be a confessional state with the president being Christian and the prime minister being Sunni, and the head of the parliament being Shia, the fact is Lebanon is in shambles, and Lebanon is de facto controlled by Hezbollah today, and therefore by the Iranians. So as you can see, the Saudis feel very much surrounded and are afraid. They really view Iran as an existential threat to themselves, because Iran has over 80 million people, and most of them are, of course, Shia, not most, but very large number, very large majority is Shia. On this map that you can see, the dark green shows the Shia, and the light greens and the purple show the Sunnis. So you can see that in that region, the Shia are very, very strong. So the Saudis view really Iran as an existential threat, and they view that Iran is trying very hard to destroy them. And that's a very strong possibility. At least that's what they're trying. You know, the fact that the Iranians want to achieve that, I think, is a very strong possibility. So in light of this, everything the Saudis do have to do with their fear of Iran. And therefore, when they talk about the relationship with the United States, they view the relationship with the United States purely in what's happening in Iran and what are the risks of Iran. One of the main events lately that has happened, that has helped a great deal the foreign policy of the United States has been the fact that Saudi Arabia has finally decided that the risk which is presented by Israel is much less than the risk presented by Iran. And since the enemies of my enemies are my friends, the Saudis finally have agreed to work together with the Israelis. And you've heard of the Abraham Accords, which were mostly signed by the UAE. There's actually been a signed agreement with the UAE, with Qatar, with Bahrain, and with Oman and Sudan even, where these countries are actually establishing diplomatic relations with Israel. The Saudis have not accepted to develop relationships, diplomatic relations with Israel, but they have agreed to work together, and they have constant contacts about various issues, including military issues, which have to do with Iran. So in that sense, we're facing a situation where the Saudis will basically do anything it will take to protect themselves against Iran. Now, as a side note, why is it that Saudi Arabia is so worried about Iran? I think it's because ultimately, and I heard that from some people in Saudi Arabia, that the Saudis are really worried that in the long term, that the Iranians might make a play for Mecca, the control of Mecca and the control of Islam. Now, that may sound far-fetched, but when you see that Saudi Arabia is totally surrounded by Iran and Iranian proxies, that really gives some meaning to their fear. One of the reasons we have to remember is that Saudi Arabia itself stole Mecca fair and square in the early 1900s when they kicked the Hashemites out of Mecca and the Turks out of Mecca. The Hashemites were allied to the Turks at the time, and so they know that it can be done. Things can be taken and changed. And 100 years ago is not that long ago in the scheme of things. So they have an existential threat. They feel the existential threat very, very strongly. So one of the consequence of this is that the fact that the Biden administration is trying to rejoin the JCPOA, the nuclear accord with Iran, is not appreciated in Saudi Arabia. And it's not appreciated because they fear that if the JCPOA came back into existence and the sanctions against Iran placed by the United States were lifted, then it would give Iran, it would put Iran back into the oil market. It would allow Iran to buy and to sell a lot of oil and buy a lot of goods from overseas, and could become much wealthier than it has been for the past few years under sanction. That scares the Saudis because they're afraid that it will give the Iranians more means to do nefarious things in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, etc., etc., etc. So they are worried about that. Now, of course, from our own standpoint, we are not so keen in doing everything Saudi Arabia wants. I mean, you've heard all the criticism of Saudi Arabia of their, killing Jamal Khashoggi, as we discussed last year. For those of you who were in the meeting last year, I discussed that at length, and that was a major mistake by Saudi Arabia to do this murder. And they've never come up clean with that. A lot of people in Congress especially are criticizing Saudi Arabia for having ordered, for the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia for having ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and they've never come clean with that. I'm not sure what the solution here for that is. You also have heard that there was a lot of dissidents who had been arrested and tortured for years and years and years, and that the Saudis were begged to release them. Eventually, just a couple of weeks ago, one of the main dissidents, a young woman was released after 3 years in jail and apparently a lot of torture, some torture and so on, which of course the Saudis deny. Now, the Saudis have a real problem with that because one, they really do not think it's any of our business to tell them how to run their human rights policy. And of course, we think it's important they run a proper human rights policy. They want to, they also have an issue because if the human workers, the human rights workers and people we really care about are the liberals, the people who want to bring Saudi Arabia in the 21st century, who prefer to have more of a democracy in the kingdom than any other system. But the Saudis do not want, the Saudi leadership does not want to have that. But mostly, they also want to be protected against the religious establishment. And you remember that the religious, I shouldn't say establishment, but the religious extremists in Saudi Arabia are very powerful. And the leadership has arrested hundreds and hundreds of them. So if they feel that they have to release the liberals to appeal to us, then to appeal to the others in the kingdom, within the kingdom, they would have to release a lot of the extremists, the Islamist extremists, which they cannot do because then it becomes, again, another existential threat to them. So it is a very, very difficult situation for them. So basically, the crown prince today, who is very much in power, is hitting right and hitting left. And he's creating the situation where he's the only one who can make decisions. But if he releases too many of the liberals, then he will be very, very strongly criticized by the more extremist Islamists in the region. So that will create some big problem for the kingdom. So the point here, I think, mainly is that they will not cooperate with us joining into the JCPOA. They are probably willing to make a big effort to bring some peace into Yemen because they know that, one, it costs them an enormous amount of money. It's given them extremely bad press in Yemen because they kept bombing the wrong place and killing a lot of civilians and whatnot, even though they were trying to get rid of the Hezbollah and the groups that are controlled by Hezbollah and so on. They still made a lot of mistakes, and that's given them more than bad press. It's been a terrible problem for them. So they really would like to limit their activities in Yemen, but they have not been successful because when they try to negotiate a deal with Iran on these issues, Iran has absolutely no interest in negotiating a deal because at this point they're winning the war very easily in Yemen, and therefore there is no arrangement at this point. So I'm not sure exactly how this will develop in the very near future, but the Saudis want to have a good relationship with the United States because they view the United States as really the only place that can defend them against the Iranians. And then they're afraid at this point because they're afraid that we're about to make a deal with the Iranians, which will increase the Iranian power. So no easy solution at this situation. Before I stop talking here a little bit, I just want to say one word is oil. We haven't talked about oil, and it's really interesting because normally when we talk about Saudi Arabia, we always talk about oil. So maybe we don't need the map just right now. Actually, we can just have the conversation with our own pictures. But the oil today is still very important in Saudi Arabia because it controls, the Saudis still export about 7 million barrels a day, and most of those exports go to the Far East today. They sell almost no oil to the US, very little in Europe. Most of the oil goes to China, is the biggest buyer of oil in Saudi Arabia, and they also sell, of course, a lot of oil to Japan and to Korea as well, and the Far East in general. They also sell more and more oil to India, which is a very much growing market for them. So the Saudis know very well that they need to move away from oil in the long term. They know that the need of the world for oil is declining, but they have two positions on that. One of them is, well, they will always be the cheapest producers of oil in the world, and that's true because they have the best access to the oil. They are right next to the water. Their cost is maybe $6 a barrel, so they will always make some money selling that. And there will always be demand for oil for at least the next 50 years, and the last guy standing will be the Saudis. So they know that. On the other hand, they also know they have to evolve, because first of all, oil by itself doesn't create that many jobs. They have to diversify, and they have to go into, if they want to remain as an important power in the world, they have to really give their youth an opportunity to do other things. So there has been a lot of talk and absolutely amazing size conferences on how to diversify, what to do, and so on. And they know that they have to decarbonize. That is really the big theme of most of their conferences today. So how are they going to decarbonize? They're spending an enormous amount of money, hundreds of billions of dollars, developing what's called carbon capture and storage, where they take the CO2 from all their own plants, because they use 3 million barrels of their own oil to make water, to desalinate water, make electricity and whatnot. They can decarbonize that and inject it back into the ground. They want to develop an enormous industry of hydrogen, of green hydrogen. So they want to develop large plants, the solar plants, to make hydrogen, and then they can either use it directly to burn in their own desalination plant and electricity plant, or they can transform it into ammonia and green ammonia and sell it worldwide to power a whole bunch of things. They also want to go into tourism. They want to develop a military industry, and they know that in order to do all this stuff, they have to change society. So there's been an enormous amount of work done by the Saudis to change their society. It is quite interesting to see that today, wherever you go in Saudi Arabia, you will see mostly the young Saudis working in things which in the past they never worked on, like hotels, being servers in restaurants and coffee shop and whatnot. They are also increasingly becoming engineers here and there, and they have excellent engineering schools. So they are pushing very hard to Saudiize their economy, and that implies bringing the women in the workforce. And they've done a really fantastic job of bringing women in the workforce on that. And this is really quite new. And this is also, by the way, one of the reasons why they have the Crown Prince in particular is putting enormous pressure on the Islamist extremists who don't want this kind of things to happen. So in essence, the society is changing. The Saudis are extremely worried about the future. They are worried that the United States may let them down and start favoring Iran. And even if it doesn't favor Iran, it allows Iran to come back, and that is dangerous to them. So maybe I'll just leave it at this, because I've taken my 20-some minutes here, and perhaps we can have some questions, Helen, if you have.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. There has been one question posed to start with. If you could speak further to the U.S. Might be interested in talking to Iran about possibly revisiting the nuclear accord that the U.S. left under Trump. Where do you see that initiative going?
I think the Iranians desperately need an agreement. The Iranian economy, I hear, is in very, very bad straits. But the leadership of Iran is also extremely tough, and they would they have made a lot of openings to the U.S. saying we should go ahead and have an agreement, but we want you, and that was this morning's statement actually by Zarif, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, saying that we, before we make any deal with the Saudis, with the U.S., before we bring the U.S. Back into the JCPOA and agree to all the agreements, to all the changes which the JCPOA are required in terms of nuclear policy, we want the U.S. to release the sanctions, to let the sanctions go. And I don't know what the U.S. administration will do, but at that point, I agree with the Saudis that if we let the sanctions go before we rejoin the JCPOA, then that implies a lot of money going into the Iranian coffers, and that implies a lot of trouble in Lebanon, a lot of trouble in Syria, a lot of trouble in Yemen, and God knows where else Hezbollah and all these people are active. So the Saudis are worried about that very much. So whether or not we will rejoin, I think there's a lot of effort within the administration, because President Biden has mentioned in the past that he wanted to rejoin JCPOA, because it is true that if the Iranians have been pretty good about keeping their words when we were within JCPOA, so it will delay the Iranian building a bomb for maybe 10 years or so, and that is probably true, but it won't stop them from beating up on the Saudis and all the other countries around without nuclear weapons. So I'm not sure whether or not the US will go ahead and rejoin JCPOA. I think we should rejoin JCPOA. It would be good, but not at any cost. And if the cost is to pass on a lot of money to Iran today, I think that would be a mistake.
Okay. The second question is turning to the Kingdom of Jordan. The king there flies below the international screen, but he clearly got involved in blocking the sale of surplus Cobra helicopters to support a group of mercenaries linked to an American named Prince, whose sister was Secretary of Education under the former president. What do you think?
Well, yes, I think Jordan, the king of Jordan, the kings of Jordan in general, but this king in particular is very savvy, and they know very well that if you start putting that kind of weapons, helicopters and so on in the hands of mercenaries, you're going to run into a lot of trouble. So I think the Jordanian king has done the right thing in this case, and that's the kind of things which I don't think the Biden administration would go along doing anyway. I think if, under Trump, maybe that kind of things could have been done, but in this case, I just don't think that would be proper. So I don't see this kind of things continuing very much. And I think the King of Jordan is very much eager to show to the Israelis and to show to the Americans that he is he's doing a very credible policy. So I think that will, I think I've answered what I could on this.
A couple of questions. People want to know, where is Russia in all this?
I didn't talk about two things, which but again, we're talking about all these rabbit holes. We're going to go down these rabbit holes that never get out. But you have Russia and you have Turkey. We haven't talked about Turkey either, and I should talk about Turkey. But the question is about Russia, and Russia is very interested in keeping its control, or at least its influence. I shouldn't say its control, but its influence on Syria. It's also very eager to continue having some influence on Iran. But there is really no lost love between the Iranians and the Russians going back centuries. So, but the Iranians desperately need the Russians today, because the Russians have provided them with a nuclear reactor, so they have electricity and they learn a lot from that. And they also the Russians help the the Iranians to sell some of their oil, but they're not pushing it too much because, after all, Iran is really a competitor to Russia. I mean, Russia is the second largest producer of oil in the world and the second largest exporter of oil in the world. So after Saudi Arabia, so they're not that eager to bring Iranian production back in because the price would decline, and therefore the Russians' influence might, get hurt as well. On the other hand, the Russians are very strong in Syria to this day, and they're helping the Syrian government to reestablish itself in the country, and that's something they work with the Iranians to work together on that, but also against the Iranians because they're not so fond of the Iranians having control of the Syrian government. The Iranians, the Russians are of course very happy to see that there could be some tensions between Saudi Arabia and the United States because they're very eager to sell a lot of weapons to Saudi Arabia and to increase their influence in the Gulf. They haven't really been successful at that just yet, but they're always there. And so the Russians are very keen and keep an eye open for any kind of opportunity they can put their hands on in the region anyway.
Let's see, if I'm recalling last year's map correctly, Iran's footprint is much bigger. What additional threats does this bring beyond Saudi Arabia?
Well, I mean, I think what we discussed, if I understand the question right, and I may not, but the footprint, Iran is really pushing very hard to develop its influence, as we said, in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and wherever else they can do that. So that's what scares the whole region, and especially the Saudis in particular. Remember, it also scares the Israelis because Iran is very strong, and they have, if they can bring their influence all the way to Syria and all the way down south in Syria, well, that is really the border to Israel. And of course, Iran is a huge country, and it has 80-some million people, which is 4 times the local population of Saudi Arabia, and 10 times the population of Israel. So even more than that. So I think yes, it's very important to it's huge.
How has COVID affected the region, and how are they on vaccinations, or do you know?
Well, they are. I mean, the UAE in particular has been very successful on the vaccination issue. They have vaccinated pretty much their entire population. Now, of course, in the UAE, it's a little difficult to know what we mean by population. We mean there are 11 million people in the UAE, basically. But out of that 11 million, only 1 million are locals, or 1.5 million are locals. So the locals got all their shots. The expatriates, maybe a third of them or half of them got their shots as well. So they've made a lot of progress. The Saudis have been, of course, hit, but not as hard as many countries because they actually closed down the country immediately. When I was in Saudi Arabia was last year, just about this time. And when I was on one of the last airplanes leaving the kingdom, I didn't even know it was the last airplane leaving the kingdom. Thank God, I would have been a nervous wreck. But they closed. Immediately they shut down the pilgrimage, which for the Saudis is a huge thing. They shut down the pilgrimage. They shut down all the airplanes going in and out. And they've kept that going for quite a while. They reopened it, and now they reclosed it again. So they've been really very, very strong on keeping a lid on this. And they still have some infections and some deaths, but compared to what we have, it's really nothing. So I think the region, by and large, has done rather well, in fact.
Someone said if you could speak further to Turkey.
Well, we need about 3 hours there, but it's very interesting. I mean, Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, is a very interesting character, really. Maybe not a likable character, but a very interesting character. I think Turkey views itself as a very important country in the world. They have a very high opinion of themselves, and honestly, I think that Erdogan is really looking to reestablish the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottoman Empire used to include Syria. You know, it used to include Egypt. Then it lost it more or less, but it used to include a lot of Saudi Arabia. It controlled the Hashemites all the way down to Mecca. It controlled, you know, the Gulf itself, and nobody controlled the center of Arabia because there was nothing there. But it was a huge, important empire, and I think Erdogan has this notion, if you like, that under his view of Islam, that the Turkey can become one of the leaders of Islam and one reestablish its predominance in the world. And he's working really hard to that effect. So he's now, he was afraid that, I mean, the Americans were too tough on him, so he didn't like it. So he went to talk to the Russians, which is interesting because there were so many wars and millions of people killed between the Turks and the Russians fighting each other. But nevertheless, he's now friendly with the Russians. He bought some SAM missiles, which are, of course, anathema to the United States and NATO. It is really trying to control the northern part of Syria by keeping a very strong foot against on the Kurds, who are allied to us, by the way, in that part of Syria. He's also now bringing in a lot of incursions into the northern Iraq, which is also, you know, some parts of the Kurdish groups are very anti-Turks. Some are pro-Iranians. It's a, you know, as usual, a very complicated story. But I think the Turks are pushing very hard to, they try to take advantage of any situation they can to bring forward their advantage and to develop their control of this area or that area. And of course, they're a little bit worried about the, you know, the new administration. They don't know how to talk to Biden, to the president, and to Blinken and all the other the people at the State Department and the military. But lately this week, he's made some big openings to the United States. You know, like he said, we have a lot of differences of opinions and so on, but nothing is so important that it cannot be resolved. And I'm not sure how that resolves the issue of the missiles, but we'll see. In any case, Turkey has a very important role in the region. They have a base, it's a small base, but a base nevertheless in Qatar. They have a base in Eritrea. They play a big role in the Horn of Africa in particular, and we'll see if they can afford to continue doing that. But they're trying to do it on the cheap, if you like. But they are pretty successful. Their presence in Qatar has been a big problem for the Saudis. Now, remember, the Saudis are worried about the Iranians taking over Mecca, but they also are very worried about the Turks trying to come back to Mecca. Because after all, it used to be under the Turkish control for centuries. So, you know, they're a little worried about that. So the relationship between Turkey and Saudi Arabia is a little tricky. And the Turks today are very much influenced by the Muslim Brothers. And again, that's another rabbit hole we don't really want to have time to get into. But the Muslim Brothers are very much detested by the UAE and disliked by the Saudis, but they're very much liked and encouraged by the Qataris, which was the source of the tension between those countries, which have more or less been pasted over lately. But the Turks still have their base in Qatar, and that worries the region quite a bit because these things can expand rapidly.
Right. Next question is, what signals has the move of the U.S. Israeli embassy to Jerusalem sent to the Arab world?
it said that the United States and Israel, especially under the Trump administration, was going to take as much advantage of the weakness of the fear of the Iranians, because the Saudis in particular, the UAE in particular, didn't really say anything when we moved the embassy, and for decades this was really the main point of the Arab world, was to fight on behalf of the Palestinians. They basically sacrificed the Palestinians and the Saudis and the UAE and so on, because they're so afraid of Iran. And the US administration at the time, we may or may not like them, and we may strongly disagree with a lot of things they've done, but they've taken advantage of that situation to do what Netanyahu wanted. And they've been very, very friendly to Netanyahu. And basically, Netanyahu has obtained everything he wanted from the Trump administration. And just at the time that the Saudis and the UAE, the strong powers of the region, could not do anything because they wanted to keep the American support relative to Iran. And so in a sense, it's been played very well from a purely political standpoint. It's very sad for the Palestinians who've basically been sacrificed. And today the Palestinians have no power whatsoever, and they do not count, which is even worse and in the long term, probably not a good thing.
And then there's another question. If China is one of Saudi Arabia's largest importers of oil, do they have any influence on what Iran is doing?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, the Chinese position is very strong, and the Chinese are able to deal with everybody very happily. And the Saudis in particular are getting closer, much closer to the Chinese than they used to. When they sell the Gulf itself, the Arab part of the Gulf today is selling over 4 million barrels a day of oil to China, which is 40% of the imports of China. And those are huge figures. And not only that, the Chinese are selling to the Saudis and to the UAE tens of billions of dollars of products every day. I mean, every month. And so China has a lot of influence in the region. They don't have an enormous amount of political influence. They don't have very much of a military influence. And why should they? We're there. We have our ships. We keep the lanes open. We can bring the trade back and forth for, totally freely. And the people who have the most benefit from this are the Chinese and the Japanese and the Koreans, who are really the main trade partners to the Gulf today. So we're not, that's a great benefit we provide to everybody. But the Chinese are moving slowly, but very strongly into becoming more important. Now they want to keep their friendship with Iran, because remember, they're not that far from Iran. There's a little piece of China way back there that is pretty close to Iran. So they want to keep their friendship with Iran, but they also know that as long as the United States has strong sanctions and secondary sanctions against Chinese companies dealing with Iranians, it's going to hurt the Chinese economy. So they try to be nice to the Iranians. They talk a lot. They sign big agreements, like $20 billion at a time, but they never do anything per se. But they also want to keep a lot of good links with the Gulf in particular, and they have enormous links with Iraq. They buy almost 2 million barrels a day of oil from Iraq. So they keep all this, and the Chinese influence is really growing by the day. There's no doubt about that. Not just on oil, it's the same with chemicals, petrochemicals, and all manners of other products, which the Gulf exports to China, and China sells other, goods to the region. So I think China is becoming very, very important in the region. If we decide to leave the region, the Chinese will look forward to helping the region get over the absence of the United States, I'm sure.
Sure. In regard to the previous question, someone asked, do you think the American embassy will stay in Jerusalem?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Oh,
Yeah, I think that's, no, the decision has been made by Trump, but I don't think the Biden administration will not change that whatsoever. The difficult decision, the difficult point was the decision was made, and they're going to stick with it. I think it's changing it back would be too much of a difficult political move by the Biden administration against Israel and the Israeli supporters in this country.
You know, and kind of summing up, do you think there is one thing we should keep our eye out for in the coming year to watch out for in the region in particular?
Well, I think we have to, there are so many things that could happen. Frankly, one of the things we really have to keep an eye on is what's happening in Lebanon, because we really could have the civil war start again in Lebanon. I mean, we lived in Jordan during the civil war in Lebanon, and I went to the Lebanon during the civil war many times, and it was very, very disheartening to see such a nice country being torn apart by the fights between the Sunnis and the Shia and the Christians and the various parts of the Christians who were fighting each other, and it was really terrible. And the violence and the nastiness of the war was just tremendous. This could start anytime again, and because the civil war in Lebanon ended because of Saudi intervention, not military intervention, because of the political intervention of Saudi Arabia. They succeeded in creating peace in Lebanon for years. That now the Saudis have basically been kicked out by the Iranians, by Hezbollah in particular, but behind Hezbollah was the Iranians. So today there is a lot of emphasis on the fact that this has to change. We cannot let Hezbollah control the region, and the Saudis are probably going to take some action against that sooner or later. So I would not be surprised if there was a civil war starting in Lebanon again. And that is going to create a lot of problems. Now, this will continue the violence in Syria. There will be more trouble in Syria. That's another thing to look at between Erdogan and the Turks and the Syrian Kurds. In particular, there should be a fair amount of violence right there. And there's the Idlib, the small area, the county, the small state, if you like, north of Syria, where the more extreme Sunni fighters are, is going to be run over by Assad sooner or later. And that's going to be thousands and thousands of people killed. But we don't know exactly how that's going to develop. Will the Turks take side with the extremists, which I doubt, or will the Kurds fight the extremists, which if they do, then the Turks will attack the Kurds. It's a little complicated, the story. So I'm really worried about that. And of course, then if we go to the Gulf itself, then we have other possibilities of great tension. If the JCPOA and get signed and we give the Iranians end up having less sanctions and make more money, I'm sure they will use a lot of that money to create more trouble in Yemen. So I think that is not going to go away anytime soon. So I'm not terribly optimistic, really, but I guess it's nothing new, unfortunately. No, I'm not optimistic, I guess. That's really my conclusion.
When did you come home from Saudi Arabia? When you said you were on the last flight, when was that?
I think February 28th, I think last year, something of this nature, the 25th maybe.
So do you have any idea when you'll be able to go back?
Well, I was planning on going back last August for a few days, but that didn't happen.
Yeah.
No, I have no idea. I have no idea.
Sure.
I'm not getting any younger either, so it's a little traveling is getting harder and harder, so I have less incentives to go back. But I think it would be quite exciting to go back, especially with all the changes they're doing on the economy today in Saudi Arabia, which is really quite remarkable. And that would be fun to see anyway. So we'll see.
Sure. Well, Dr. Cessnick, we really appreciate your coming and kind of updating us on the region. It's as complicated as ever. We're glad you have a good handle on all the different things going on, because it just keeping track of all the different regions and what is going on is complicated. And
Yes,
and then as soon as you think you understand it, it changes. So we really appreciate your time. Did I miss a question from anyone? It's always hard to see a little bit. It's so much easier in a room. But I think we're good to go. But we really appreciate your time with us today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And you know, we just I think in the end it'll be interesting to see what happens with Iran, and as you said, Lebanon and the whole region, to see what happens in the coming year. So. But
Very
grateful for your time with us today. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. And thank you, First Pres, for tuning in. And everyone,
Yes,
have a good week.
And looking forward to seeing everybody in person one of these days.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hopefully next year we'll be back in person and can really engage. So
That's
thank
right.
you.
That'll be great. Thank you.
Take care,
Thank you.
everyone.
Okay,
Goodbye.
bye-bye.
Thank you.